presentation. So again, thank you so much for joining us to welcome our guest speaker tonight at this Third Thursday Food for Thought program. For tonight, O Pueblo is delighted to welcome our guest again, speaker, archaeologist Andrew Christenson, PhD. Dr. Christenson has been a professional archaeologist of Arizona for 50 years, with breaks in Southern California and Illinois. In school at UCLA, he was fortunate to get a heavy dose of the new archaeology, which has served him well, with modifications since then. He was fortunate again to get his first full-time job on the Black Mesa project in northern Arizona, which led to being a visiting scholar at the Arizona State Museum and to working in northeastern Arizona's Tuskegee Canyon for a number of seasons, and says he met his future wife in Carbondale 35 years ago and fortunately got dragged to Prescott, Arizona. Since then, he has been a private consultant doing archaeological surveys and ceramic and stone artifact analysis. And now he is also the curator of the Museum of Indigenous People in Prescott. The presence of an Arizona Archaeological Society chapter in Prescott drew him into various issues with that area's archaeology, including investigation of the Prescott archaeological culture sites known as the Coyote Ruin and the Fitz Morris Ruin. This evening, he will show you and discuss with us the archaeology of the West Central Arizona region in his presentation titled 100 Years Plus of Prescott Culture Archaeology. Please welcome this month's Third Thursday Food for Thought guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Christenson.
Okay, I share screen at this point.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Megan and Alan. There's a lot to say about Prescott culture, and what I'm going to focus on tonight are some particular issues I'm dealing with. I won't talk about the origins or the cultural sequence, but I will look at some historical issues on the origin of the concept, look very closely at the pottery, and what was going on during the late period, meaning late 1100s to 1300, at Fitzmaurice Pueblo, the second largest community in the Prescott culture area. First, I will look at the development of archaeology in this area up to about the 1970s. I should point out this is approximately the area that we're talking about. Flagstaff's over here, Prescott's over here, Seligman and Kingman. These boundaries were an idea of Harold Colton, but they more or less represent at least the heartland of Prescott culture. There is an odd little phenomenon up here in the Wupaki area that I'll mention very briefly later on. One of the issues in archaeology is paying attention to of who our predecessors were. And this particular little diagram was created for an exhibit I did on the relationship of archaeology, and professional archaeologists and amateurs in the Prescott area. And it shows red meaning amateurs and black meaning professionals working together to talk about the Prescott culture and understand the Prescott culture. In the 1920s, there was a period when archaeologists who were mostly amateurs were taking an interest in Central Arizona archaeology. And that interest continued up until the pretty much current century through the Yavapai chapter of the Arizona Archaeological Society here in town. J.W. Fuchs, who's shown on the left, was the first person to really look at Prescott archaeology seriously. And he was in the area circa 1900. And his observations, he concluded that the locality of the ruins here were considered the locality of the ruins here considered is the western frontier of the ancient Pueblo culture. The inhabitants of this region, an agricultural people, were subject to attack by powerful nomadic tribes. Here, where defensive structures were necessary, we should naturally look for a relatively large number of forts or fortified hilltops. The Upper Verde River and Walnut Creek flow through a part of Arizona occupied to within a few years by the Yavapai, who reasonably may be regarded as descendants of the prehistoric house builders. So this brief statement covers a number of issues that still occupy archaeologists working in the area today. Whether we recognize it or not, we have been preceded by others, and those others who I just showed you previously right here, some of them, are understanding what they did and recognizing either their dubious work or their positive pathfinding work is critical. So in 1926, J.W. Simmons, an itinerant laborer, had the good fortune to encounter Fuchs and John Harrington, shown here at the left, digging at Eldon Pueblo. And that event led to his focusing the last decades of his life, digging, photographing, documenting northern and central Arizona sites and trying to interest professional archaeologists. On the right is a rare photo of Simmons a little later in his life, digging a test pit at La Ciudad, where he lived in a small house through the courtesy of his friend, Frank Midville, who was also one of the amateurs interested in Central Arizona. After his brief stop at Eldon Pueblo, Simmons came down to Prescott looking for work, and he found out about a Pueblo in Lonesome Valley that he called Coyote Ruin, and his digging there was the first site in the Prescott area to be documented. He then moved on to digging the burial ground at Fitz Morris Ruin, now called Fitzmaurice Pueblo, and worked very hard to get professional archaeologists interested in the area. In 1931, he took A.V. Kidder on a tour of local archaeological sites, and Kidder offered to support his work. But Byron Cummings, who had a strong dislike of Kidder, nixed the idea. Wanting to get his foot into the Prescott area, he offered Simmons funding to find a site to supply objects for the planned Prescott Public Museum that he hoped would become a branch of the State Museum. At that time, when he was meeting with Kidder, Simmons published his only article and became the first archaeologist to identify what he called the black on gray culture as a, quote, distinct local culture not related to any other in the Southwest, unquote. He also listed himself as an archaeologist in the phone directory, perhaps the first such listing in the Southwest. And I would be interested of anybody else who knows of an archaeologist listed in the phone book at this time. recognized as an archaeologist. In 1931, Simmons located a site in the Big Chino suitable for Cummings' purpose and began excavating the cemetery of King's Brothers Ranch under the nominal direction of Byron Cummings. While Simmons was assiduously working at the site, Cummings brought his students unannounced to the site and put them to work on the Pueblo, which they dug, and Edward Spicer was assigned the work of writing that up. Simmons also told Cummings about the Lynx Creek ruin, also known as Fitz Morris, and Caywood and Spicer, two of Cummings' students, excavated that site, part of that site in 1933. Thus, although J.W. Simmons was indispensable in producing the initial defining document on Prescott culture, which you see right here, that contains very scant acknowledgement of his work. And he had spent probably, by the time this was published in 36, he'd already spent about 10 years working in the Prescott area. Interestingly, Simmons also told Cummings of a ruin in the Verde Valley that was being pot hunted, and both Caywood and Spicer went over there to excavate Tuzigu. I should point out that the collections from all three of these sites, excavated by Simmons or by Cummings' students, were earmarked for the Prescott Museum, although circumstances intervened so that most of the Tuzigu collection remained in the Verde Valley. Simmons' critical and pioneering work in the area and his sharing of knowledge with professionals was pushed aside, and he ended up leaving for Phoenix to conduct our archaeology there for the last 20 years of his life. After this early work in Prescott, it was pretty much abandoned by archaeologists as a main focus of interest. And I will skip to the 1960s, when a New Mexico amateur archaeologist, Franklin Barnett, showed up and began excavating in the region. In a period of 6 years, Barnett excavated 10 sites, the largest of which, the focus of this talk, was Fitzmaurice Ruin, which we will call Fitzmaurice Pueblo here. Barnett was a complex man who, like Simmons, became devoted to archaeology late in life, but unlike Simmons, wasn't too interested in professionals. When I asked Watson Smith about Barnett, he said, he was an oddball who did good things and somehow usually made everyone mad at him. He was a loner and didn't collaborate gracefully. He also carried a great big chip on his shoulder because he felt that because he was a professional writer, academic archaeologists looked upon him with contempt. His wife supported him unstintingly, and when they moved to Prescott, he became convinced that no one knew anything about the early occupants, and it was his duty to set things straight. Barnett did work out a relationship with the Museum of Northern Arizona, then directed by Ned Danson. Fortunately, his ceramic analyses were done by museum staff, and most of his site reports were published by the museum. And again, fortunately, parts of his collections ended up there. At Fitzmaurice, Barnett worked in the main Pueblo, excavating 23 of the 27 rooms, and we're talking about this area right here is the main Pueblo. And he did 3 rooms on the exterior right in this area. But as you can see, it's a fairly large site. The numbers refer to the rooms that Caywood excavated, 5 structures. It seems that Barnett and his wife only had a couple of helpers during this excavation. He screened and used a Polaroid camera to photograph. It is unclear how he documented his work because his papers have not survived. He recorded fill versus floor for some artifacts, but not for the sherds, and this is all in his report. Other than obvious retouched items, chipstone tools were not counted and seemingly have not survived. He did not try to date the charcoal or the posts found in his excavations, and he did not gather any botanical remains, although he did save some of the faunal bone, including a macaw bone. The results of this work occurred in a major monograph published by the Museum of Northern Arizona. And it is a pretty much technical discussion of his excavation. He also published a novel about the site. And he fancied himself as being more of a writer than an archaeologist. And this is a place where he got a chance to sort of talk about the people, as opposed to here in this report, he's talking more or less about the archaeological remains. So he was able, by looking at bonding and abutting details, to basically see that the site was constructed in 6 phases of the main pueblo. One unit here, another unit here, a unit going around this way, and then 3 at the end. It's interesting that they seem to have been put together in units more or less of three rooms. An examination of the exterior and interior doorways indicated that the first room block had 2 interior doorways connecting the 3 rooms. Here. The second block seems to have had no interior rooms here, but did have a crawl hole going outside. So here is an exterior access point. And this is what the crawl hole looked like. It is literally, you have to get down on your hands and knees and crawl through. Let's go back here. The third room block, which had no interior doorways at all, which is pretty amazing, blocked the crawl hole, eliminating exterior access of the pueblo from at this point to the end, because there is no exterior access visible from this point. Only 4 doorways connect the other rooms in the pueblo. One there, one there, one there, one there. It means access to most of the rooms was through the roof. Lack of access to the pueblo from the outside at ground level is easy to understand if there were security issues, but the lack of interior access is a little peculiar. Barnett made no attempt to determine the relationships of the main pueblo, which he excavated, and the rooms to the south, which were excavated by Caywood. One of which, this one here, which is about 40 square meters, seems to be the largest room in the Prescott area. A bone tool that was somehow or other associated with this room came back with a radiocarbon date around 1180. Both it and the room next to it have this kind of unusual slab lining at the base of the walls that also occurs sometimes in the Sanawa area. Because of the blocking of direct interior-exterior access, the roof area would have been important, an important work area as well as a playground, and probably had a parapet for safety. Certainly many activities in the day occurred on the roof and outside the Pueblo, with inside activities being mostly at night or on inclement days. The Pueblo roof, when completed, was about 60 by 15 meters, with walls that stuck up because of the hill shape. And here is an etching done of the Pueblo based upon Barnett's plans that sort of shows there's not a whole lot of privacy involved with these walls sticking up, but a little bit. Of course, this picture only shows a few people on the roof. I suspect that there were a lot more people working on the roof and doing a variety of activities. Although there's reason to think that some of the items in the fill of the rooms were deposited there as part of a termination event, it is also likely that many of these objects are from roof activities and fell in when the room burned. In particular, the situation with grinding tools and so-called floor beam supports is of interest. These are the only artifacts that were found associated with the Pueblo that could be called architectural, at least portable artifacts. And they are not really floor beam supports. They're more likely supports for platforms or benches. Fitz Morris has the largest number found in the Prescott area. 8 were found on floors, but not in place, as is often typical with these architectural objects. 16 were found in the fill, suggesting the likelihood that they came from activities on the roof. With the roof as an activity location, there would have been an array of architectural features, including hearths, benches, mealing areas, shades, and perhaps storage areas. We should ponder the fact that the rooms with roof entry only were very dark and not a particularly pleasant place to work. But there is evidence from the quantity of grinding tools on the floors that a lot of the grinding occurred inside the rooms, including some that didn't seem to have a hearth. And that must have been a fairly dark and cold situation. Also, we should ponder the fact that children would have to be carried up and down ladders until they were about 2 or 3, and that elderly people may have had to live outside the Pueblo once they became too infirm. I'll stay here. Using a variety of information, I've guesstimated the population of Fitz Morris at the peak as being around 77 people. And that comes from using a variety of criteria, room numbers and such like that. So perhaps 15 households. It gives you at least a rough idea of how many people may have been living there. So as I said earlier, this is the largest excavated prehistoric Prescott culture Pueblo, with Woolsey Ranch Pueblo downstream being larger, but we haven't really no knowledge of that Pueblo. So I want to switch now to pottery because that is one of the major characteristics of looking at and defining Prescott culture. I mentioned that J.W. Simmons was the first to define what he called the black on gray culture. In his excavation report on Fitz Morris, Caywood defined Prescott grayware as having quartz, feldspar, and mica. A second unnamed type was defined as having mica schist temper that probably is now what we call Wingfield. And a final type is described as having the same minerals as Prescott, only finer, and was locally made. He's probably referring to the most common type at the site, which in a moment I'll explain to you. Has a different mineralogy. If we move forward to Franklin Barnett's work, about 30 years from the time that Caywood was operating, his ceramic analyst called much of the plainware at the site Tuzigoot red or Tuzigoot plain, feeling that the temper and vessel form were similar to those found, that type found in the Verde Valley, but thought that this was a local made version. When I was doing work at another project nearby, I found that a lot of sherds, the bulk of the sherds, the plainwares anywhere, were made with gabbro clays, and then confirmed that Fitzmaurice Pueblo had the same pottery. And after much debate with myself, I chose to call it the Fitzmaurice series with plain red and decorated types. Here's an example of what a Prescott sherd looks like, with large temper, granitic orientation, meaning quartz and feldspar and some mica, granite or granodiorite. Here's an example of Fitzmaurice with its gabbro temper, pyroxene and plagioclase. And here you can see cross section here. The late Tom Weiss was able to find a clay source not far from the Pueblo and made vessels from clay and wrote a book about it. So here he is showing a vessel made from clay that originated very close to Fitzmaurice. This type of pottery makes up about 50% of all the sherds at Fitzmaurice, but it's not terribly common beyond the site itself. Now let's focus on the infamous Prescott black on gray. The first people to look at the most common decorated pottery in the Prescott area, Fuchs, Simmons, and Gladwin, did not have much to say except that designs were simple, which is a misstatement for sure, although perhaps understandable if you only see the sherds. That changed dramatically when Edward Spicer took up writing the King's Ruin collection for his master's thesis, and he had access to many complete vessels. He excoriated the Prescott potters. It may be safely said that the King's Ruin potters did not understand design. They were not only incapable of handling a paintbrush with accuracy and skill, but they also seemed to have had no sense of symmetry. This disregard of symmetry and failure of the imagination, together with the consistent carelessness of execution of the simplest lines or even dots, indicates a total lack of artistic sense. The idea grows on one who examines much black on gray pottery that it is the product of childish minds lacking in patience, skill, and constructive imagination. Well, that certainly puts the Prescott potters in place. I should note that the last sentence was taken out of the published version, but the rest of that is in the published version. More recently, Kevin Harper in his NAU thesis suggested that Prescott culture potters were not as skilled or practiced at laying out a complex design, and that unlike the Kayenta, the message of social identity was not conveyed in the symmetry of design and perhaps was expressed in basketry or clothing or other material form. The implication here is that symmetry is an expected way for a group to express social identity, and that maybe the Prescott culture people did it somewhere else. But what if the Prescott culture potteries express their identity in part by very calculated, non-symmetrical design? Imagine our potter in the Prescott area looking at a newly arrived bowl brought in by a trader and made to the far northeast. What if that potter thought, what a neat design. Let's see what I can do with it. But what if she thought, boy, these people are pretty uptight. What's their problem? Why didn't they paint the same story or prayer this way? The idea of ridicule or humor or playfulness does not commonly come up in discussion of prehistoric pottery design. Although classic membrane pottery certainly jumps out as being in at least the last two categories. Occasionally humor is mentioned for rock art images, but in general, interpretation of prehistoric design takes a serious note. A valid question to ask about any design is who is the intended audience? Specifically looking at bowls, who is the audience of designs painted inside pots? I should flip over to some other Prescott culture designs here. This is like a crazy quilt. What if the intended audience, okay, so obviously the initial audience is always the painter herself, but her choices of what and how to paint have a variety of origins. Teachers, family, neighbors, traders, and consumers. So they may be audiences that the audience has in mind in addition to herself as she paints. But what if the intended audience is the other than human world? And it was not thinness of lines or symmetry of designs that was critical, but the very act of painting, a personal ritual. There is certainly recognition of the power of designs against bad or to support good. And this serious side of design should not be ignored, even as they might stick their tongue out at neighboring potters. Here's a few more. Sometimes black on grays in designs are poorly visible because of what we would call over-reduction in firing. But the shiny mica, which you can see here, although not diagnostic of the type, is very common and would have made the vessel showy. Unlike Spicer, I think we should take as the null hypothesis that the Prescott potters were skilled and usually got the results they wanted. That they did not live up to our expectations is our problem. Of course, potters make mistakes, and there were certainly poorly trained or young or aged potters, but they do not account for most of what we see. And I'll flip through these just slowly again so you can see. And that's pretty symmetrical. Not too bad. This is very interesting. And that is a crazy quilt. And this is, I use this as my book plate because I thought that was just an amazing design. Okay, now we're going to skip to dating. Painted brownware sticks out in the Prescott culture area because it is fairly common, especially in the late period, where it was in the range of 4%, which is sort of down in here, up to as much as 30% up here. Although I lean towards the idea that black on gray decoration is one aspect of cultural identity, only about a third of Prescott bowls and only a quarter of the jars were decorated. So the majority of vessels used on a day-to-day basis would not have been painted. Also, we are faced with the likelihood that only certain villages in the culture area could have made the ware because it is made from residual granite clay. Perhaps one of the unique traits of the in the whole Southwest of Prescott pots is looking at painting on the inside of the jars, all the way to the bottom, as you can see in this example here. These are from at Las Vegas Ranch, but there are examples of this type of painting also at Fitz Morris. So now I want to talk a little bit about connections between Fitz Morris, which is right here, and some of the other larger Prescott culture sites. The black circles indicate sites with estimated 30 or more people. So this area is about 40 miles long by 30 miles wide, with some other smaller sites around. And I add Prescott Pueblo here because it's an interesting site that has a mixture of Prescott black on gray and Jeter yellow ware, rather unusual combination. And its affiliation, I'm not ready to say for sure, but it's obviously a site halfway sort of between the Verde Valley and what I call the Prescott area. What kind of connections do we have within this area? Certainly because Prescott grayware could not have been made at sites like Archaeology or sites like King's Ruin, which is a type site for the pottery, because there's no granite nearby. So the pottery there, those places, and also Las Vegas sites had to have been made somewhere else and traded in. The Fitzmaurice series of pottery, which was most likely made in this area and maybe at small sites nearby, doesn't seem to have moved too much outside of Fitzmaurice area. I've found a few examples at sites, within 10 or so miles, but it's not terribly common. The problem is that people have not been recognizing the type, and so it would be useful to have additional examination of sites like Coyote Ruin, where I had discovered, or I'd named this type when they were doing their ceramic analysis, but just didn't identify it. So pottery was definitely moving around. Phyllite probably was moving around for tabular tools, and sandstone for braiding tools. And obsidian occurs up here in the Big Chino. So these are kind of local items that would have been traveling around in this area as well as beyond. Argillite in Chino Valley is about 16 miles away from Fitz Morris and could have been procured directly, but there may have been some local control, especially because this was a really highly desired item by non-Prescott neighbors. And so it became a fairly unique item that they could have traded. Many of the items made of this material could have just been made by the person who traded for raw materials. Although the minuscule beads that were made out of these, that was probably a more specialized activity. Fitz Morris had 15 pounds of argillite, most of it in the raw stage. And that's by far the most in the Prescott area. And there is a room outside of the main pueblo that has 9 abrading slabs on the floor. It looks like a cache. I'm not sure what else they might have been abrading, but jewelry certainly is a good possibility. I would argue that the Verde Valley Sinawa were the main intermediary in terms of things like Tucson and Little Colorado pottery, macaws, turquoise, obsidian, non-local obsidian, and even shell from the south. Given the fairly small population guesstimated for the Prescott area, the late period, perhaps 600. That's a number I just got from totaling the number of rooms in the Prescott area that dated pretty much after the late 1100s till 1300. It is likely that exchange was occurring through marriage, and there may have been movement of people back and forth between the Verde Valley. Access was pretty easy. A walk from Fitz Morris to Tuzigoot through Jaeger Canyon and Jerome area might have taken 10 hours or more, depending on if you're carrying things. Certainly some shell was coming from the west, and also maybe some turquoise, Kingman area or California. And I also found a piece of asphaltum at a Prescott culture site in Upper Burrow Creek. I'm not sure of any other identifications of asphaltum in the Southwest. If you remember that first map I showed you of Prescott culture, it showed this little circle way up kind of northeast of Flagstaff. Prescott grayware makes up 2% of the sherds found in the Wupatki area. And it indicates that the pottery was going in that direction, and it was apparently mostly jars. What was in these jars? The possibility of a resident Prescott population, I think, has been thought about, but they couldn't have made Prescott pottery. That's outside your granitic area. So it's a curiosity that I haven't been able to pursue myself very much. So let's talk about dating. There's been a fair amount of radiocarbon dating done in the Prescott area. This shows the curves for a number of dates from a variety of sites. From between 1100, which is down here, and 1300 is the area, the period that I'm mostly interested in. Regardless of Dave Wilcox's declaration that the Prescott area was cleared out by 1285, clearly 1285 would be down in right about there. There are Prescott culture sites in the very late 1200s and apparently into the 1300s, early 1300s. There are also some early and middle 1300 sites that appear to be likely to be Yavapai, because you find occasional T-zone wiped or Orm Ranch plain sherds at these sites. Perkins Pueblo has not been radiocarbon dated as far as I know, but it stands out as a significant site in the sense that there are similar amounts of Prescott black on gray and Jedediah yellowware in the various rooms. And so I should point out that site, you couldn't make either one of those types at that site. So they're both trade wares, but they are trade wares that we know the beginning date for Jedediah is pretty tightly around 1325. So this provides some evidence that there may have been some Prescott pottery being made or deposited anyway after around the 1325 area. 4 radiocarbon dates have been obtained from the Fitz Morris site. They're down here at the bottom. And these were all done last year. One was done by a group researching macaws, and there was a single macaw bone in one of the exterior areas. And the Yavapai chapter of the Arizona Archaeological Society supported these 3 of these dates. The macaw died around 1180, and the 2 roof beams in an exterior room are around 1250. These are different species of wood, so they're independent dates. And a bone tool associated with room 1, that room that I was talking about earlier, that's an exterior, it's a slab lined, and probably the largest room in the Prescott area was 1180. All of these dates pertain to the death of an animal or a tree, so they give an early date for when occupation could have ceased. But unfortunately, all of these dates are for proveniences outside the Pueblo. We have some sherds and rooms in the Pueblo that have heavy soot deposits, and we hope that they might provide some datable material. So in terms of when people may have left the Pueblo, you've got these dates here, and notice that the higher end, of course, radiocarbon dates are probability curves, and both of these dates from the burned room, the probability is a little bit higher towards the late end, but so that's you know, how long does a roof last before you abandon it or burn it? In the case of these rooms, it's a good question. Many of or most of the rooms were burned in the Pueblo, and this is not an uncommon phenomenon in the Southwest. And it doesn't seem to usually represent warfare. I haven't talked much about warfare, but the fact that Fitz Morris is on a ridge top, the Pueblo was converted fairly early on to only ladder access. And there was a possible defensive wall located down near the sort of the south end of the Pueblo, indicate that security was a concern. In terms of line of sight, Fitz Morris doesn't have line of sight very far, except to the north west, because it's in a drainage. It's down, and so the line of the drainage blocks view off to the north and sights in that direction. There are, however, what are called lookouts, two of them, I believe, that provide a much longer view. And so they could have communicated to some extent with other pueblos like Coyote Ruin, which is about 15 miles away. So it's a pretty good distance. The current interpretation is that the end of the site by burning means is mostly probably a choice of the residents, but those residents left much of their movable goods on the ground. Excuse me, much of their immovable goods on the ground in rooms. This could represent a moderately hasty departure or departure to a distant destination. In looking at what's left, Barnett was anal about weighing artifacts, said that there's 1.8 tons of complete metates. That must be some kind of a record for this area anyway, and provides good evidence of one category of material culture that was on the leave list. Grinding tools that you work with on a day-to-day basis, year after year, might have been very personal objects, and leaving them may have been an issue. We know that in Mexico, grinding tools, especially this vesicular basalt ones, which is what many of our examples at Fitz Morris are, were handed down through generations. An interesting phenomenon that Barnett talks about is evidence of breakage of metates and monos. And you see a lot of effort would be taken to take this metate lengthwise and break it up. And monos, he found a stack of monos somewhere in the site. Again, we don't know the provenience, except for this metate, we don't know the provenience of all these broken items. He was primarily interested in telling us about the provenience of whole items. Given their critical role in livelihood and their possible strong attachment to their users, the intentional destruction of tools like this was probably not taken lightly. A strictly functional argument might be that this was done to deny access to the enemies, but there are also issues that cutting ties with a home involved what we would call killing objects. And certainly a lot of the pottery was broken, although it's unclear if it was sitting on the floor whole and then broke later on when the roofs fell or not. We have been involved for the last 11 years with collections that were transferred to us by the Museum of Northern Arizona from Franklin Barnett's work. And they also transferred the racks to hold the pottery. It was given to what was then the Smoki Museum and now the Museum of Indigenous People. So we ended up with 60,000 sherds in paper bags with room and type information, but that was pretty much it. And his report, which is in some ways fairly useful. for getting information about context. With the help of Helen Gasco here, shown here, who was a graduate of a Yavapai chapter ceramic identification class, we began looking at the sherds. We picked a sample of rooms on a variety of criteria, and she, over the last 10 years, has looked at 18,000 sherds from 7 rooms and from 2 of Johnston College rooms. Johnston College was a California college that sent out a couple of people to excavate a room as part of an archaeology class. Room by room, these sherds were placed into types, and then all sherds from one type were laid out on tables and matched or conjoined with other sherds from the same pot. Most of these are plainware body sherds that have been burned. So you can imagine the keen eye that it took to make decisions. And she was fairly conservative on calling sherds from the same pot. And that means that a lot of the pots didn't have rim sherds, because rim sherds are different than body sherds. They're polished, and it's hard to match them with the rest of the vessel. So a lot of archaeological work falls into exploratory data analysis. And so I'm going to inflict upon you a graph that shows 2 measures that we have for our rooms. One are the number of whole vessels and RVs, and the other is the number of percentage of matched sherds, from 0 down here to 60% here. The circles are room numbers. And it's not too surprising there's a positive relationship here, because those 2 measures are, in fact, sort of aspects of the same information. But there are some things going on here that are interesting. There are several rooms that don't seem to fit an obvious pattern. There's a room down here that's 0 and 0. It means it has no RVs and no matched sherds. Well, what does the lack of matched sherds mean? Usually it's taken as being an indicator of trash, the trash area. So that isn't too surprising. But then you have some areas here that are exterior rooms right here that have a medium number of matched sherds, but the excavators said that the trash, there was no trash in the fill, it was all on the floor. So you have a room that seems to have had whole pots, as indicated here, 3 or 5 whole pots. And the picture I showed earlier of the ground stone and polishing slabs on the floor, those look like caches sitting on a floor, but here you have trash being thrown into what appears to be a cache. So it's a interesting question. The room was burned around 1250, and it had these caches on the floor, and it had some evidence of trash sherds, and they didn't fall from the roof because that would have been in the fill. Just to make the design here a little more complex. I added the number of metates on the fill and floor for these various rooms. And there were a lot of grinding tools on some of these floors. Rooms 10 and 11 stick out as having extreme amounts of grinding tools on the floor or in the fill. Room 10 was a habitation room, room 11 a storage or activity room. And this room in particular has a very high frequency of matched sherds. So there may have been major pottery sitting on that floor or major pottery thrown in upon abandonment, because we don't know the floor fill counts for our pottery. We can't distinguish those two possibilities. So this kind of data exploration can lead in useful directions. I want to look at this area here, which is a possible trash area outside the Pueblo that has a higher frequency of matched sherds than I might expect. So I might want to look at that. But sometimes you don't really gain a whole lot. And that's just the nature of archaeology. You explore various possibilities and discover that some of them don't work out. So what happens when times get tough, as they apparently did at Fitz Morris? At some point, there were no people living at the village. And there's a variety of places they could have gone, or a variety of adaptations they could have taken. Relatives and friends are a logical way to go. And that's why I sort of look at the Verde Valley as being a possibility, because they no doubt had strong connections there, and they were making Prescott pottery in the Verde Valley to some extent. So we know that. Increasing trade, argillite is great, but are you going to support a population on 600 on just trading argillite? Raiding is always a choice when things get bad, but it can come back on you depending on who you're raiding. A change of lifestyle is a possibility, and the one I'm looking at most myself is the last one of actually just physically moving. This is a map, Wilcox's Verde Confederacy idea. Here's Fitz Morris right here, and logically, you're not very far from your connections with the Verde Valley. Perry Mesa is down in this area, not too far down the Agua Fria. But none of these particularly have strong support, except for the fact that you already know they were doing some manufacture of Prescott black on gray in the Verde Valley. And they're just closer. So I want to point out the history of the collections very briefly. This table shows the number of excavations that have happened at Fitz Morris, who did the work, and whether there was a publication or not, and the different places that collections or notes are located. This is probably the most excavated site in certainly in the Prescott area and maybe even beyond in terms of the number of people and the time. We're talking about the last excavation was what, 47 years after the first. Unfortunately, we don't know where Franklin Barnett's notes are. The word on the street was that perhaps his wife burned them to protect whatever. But that was just a story. I never got a chance to talk with her. She was in a home in Chino Valley, but never talked with her. So the Museum of Indigenous People has much of Caywood's materials except the burial materials. Has Barnett's sherds, but not most of the other artifacts. And then has the Johnston College collection along with their notes. And that other institutions have, especially the early end is ASM. In 1978, Fitzmaurice Pueblo and the Victorian mansion nearby were designated the Lynx Creek National Register District. And in the 1990s, the landowner donated the property to the town of Prescott Valley and it became Fain Park. At that time, an advisory committee was created to consider issues with the park. And in 1999, SWCA did a detailed map, which you see here of the park, or excuse me, of the site. And a fence was built around the site because a lot of people walked along. There's a trail that walks, an old trail that goes through this area. And everybody who walked by would pick up a sherd. So, and a few people were digging. So the fence has more or less stopped that. The map that SWCA did indicates somewhat more complexity to the site than was present in some of the earlier maps, including a strange little area over here with odd structure. You can look at it on the ground. It's just not clear what's involved with that structure. Currently, site stewards monitor the site, and the town has taken varying interest in allowing access to the site. And there are still no information signs, but there seems to be plans to do that after 25 years of inaction. So here's an overview of the site with the Victorian mansion, Arlo Massic's mansion down here. And you can see the fence going around and Lynx Creek. So had easy access to water. And the lake is a later construction for mining purposes. Helen and I are working on an updated site report on Fitz Morris that will provide some new information, but like any report using old collections, will leave lots unanswered about Prescott culture and its unusual pottery. And this to me is an excellent example of exceptional design by a Prescott potter. This is no amateur designer. And that's what I have to say.
Wow, thank you so much, Andy. This is really, really informational and lots to think about. And on behalf of Old Pueblo Archaeology Center, I'd like to thank you Andy, for being our guest speaker tonight and for sharing with us this evening.
You're welcome.
And we'd also like to thank all of you for joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and look at some of the features that we have, some of the comments and questions that were placed in the chat box. So Marilyn asked, what is the source of the gabbro? Right.
So gabbro is a granitic rock, and it's right next to the site. If you look on a geological map, you can see gabbro shown in that area, but it's not a terribly common rock type. It's plagioclase and pyroxene, and it has, when you look at it in the potsherds, we could go back to the potsherds back here, and you can see the black crystals. Back. You can see the black crystals in here. Those are pyroxene. And then some of the white is plagioclase. And it's a little finer than the Prescott grayware. About as abundance, the temper is about as abundant, but it's a finer particle size. So it's fairly distinctive if you can find an eroded surface. If you find a non-eroded surface, then sometimes it may be harder to tell.
Thank you. Robert asked, are there any sites along the Copper Basin area of Southwest Prescott? And well, two questions. Are there any sites along the Copper Basin area of Southwest Prescott? And are there any indications that the Yavapai are the descendants of the Prescott culture?
Oh, gee, willikers. Well, let's answer the easy question first. Yes, Copper Basin, there was a major ASU project. Actually, it was a Prescott College and later ASU project in Copper Basin. Marvin Jeter did his dissertation work on that, a series of sites out in that area. And Marvin thought, you know, the sites were similar to some of the structures we know that Yavapai made. And so to transition into the question about Yavapai, I'm not leaning that way in terms of my interpretation. They certainly were present in the area a little after 1300 for sure, by the presence of pottery like T-zone wiped and Orm Ranch plain. But I'm not seeing them as being descendants of the Prescott culture. But as we looked in that graph of things that can happen when you have hard times, one of them is transitioning your lifestyle and perhaps intermarrying with other people, other sort of non-relatives in the process of changing your lifestyle. So it's a complex topic, and the Yavapai, unfortunately, Yavapai sites have a very difficult archaeological signature, as Peter Pillis would tell you. And so that's a hard question to answer.
That's understandable. There is a complexity there. I agree. Lynn Neal wrote, I was the field supervisor for creating that SWCA map.
Yep.
Just wanted to leave a little comment there.
Yeah, and they did a really good job of mapping that site. They found little tiny things that, you know, little features and things like that. And I haven't had a chance to go back and you know, wander around and really look at some of those features. There was a lot of pot hunting that went on outside of the main Pueblo, and who knows what came out of the site. The story was wagon loads of things came out of the site after the miners found it in the 1860s. I'm not sure what people were carrying in their wagons, perhaps metates, since metates seem to be one of the major items that is present in that site, far beyond the normal amount found in sites in the Prescott area.
Wow.
Hi, Lynn.
Doug wrote, wonderful presentation, thank you. And he also added, does NAU have anything left from Fitz Morris?
Okay, I've heard stories about J.W. Simmons was sending artifacts off to archaeologists all around the country. He was trying to interest archaeologists in the Prescott area, and he got AV Kidders to come, which was a real score for him. And he got in the newspaper. It was a big deal. This famous archaeologist comes to town because of this amateur archaeologist. And he would send potsherds and human remains to a variety of places. And there are apparently some items from Fitz Morris out. I don't have, I've heard about one possibility, but I don't have a good list of that. So yes, the collection at the early end, specifically Simmons's work, is spread in some places. I don't know about NAU having anything. But it's not impossible. It's an important site, and a lot of people have come by over the years and made collections.
Wow. Thank you. Al Dart wrote, do any of the ancestral Yavapai pottery vessels have asymmetrical layout similar to those of the Prescott culture ones?
I'm not aware of any painted Yavapai culture pots. T-zone wiped is a very common and distinctive pot, and it's got wiping, usually interior and exterior. It's made from a granitic clay. The vessel form is usually pretty distinctive. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be, what would you say, a definite obvious connection other than the just basically area. Obviously, the area that the Yavapai covered covered a lot of the same territory that the Prescott culture did.
Okay, that sounds, it looks like all of our chat
I just put in one more.
comments. Oh, okay.
Oh,
Where'd you put it?
Yeah, I noticed that one of the Prescott
Okay.
bulges showed had a lot of cross-like motifs, and that was a pretty common symbol historically among Yavapai, as I recall.
definitely, definitely. And we can go back to, let's see, we're going this way. There we go. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting how these are drawn, because one axis is narrower than the other.
Right, so some of them actually look like birds.
I'm not sure what's going on. I looked at this pot and I thought, that's really strange, but you could say that about a lot of Prescott pots. The bordered cross in particular is something that Kevin Harper noted as being unusually present in Prescott pottery. And yet I've only seen like one example. None of these examples are bordered crosses.
You're talking about outlined crosses?
Yeah, outline. Bordered. Yeah. Yeah, this is, I don't know. You can get yourself into real problems trying to figure out what is going on. The artists certainly knew what was going on, but the chances of us coming up with an answer that would satisfy people is, let's go back to, this is probably a good example of perhaps an inexperienced potter or child, perhaps, painting a design. So there certainly is evidence of that happening. But the pots themselves are made extremely well. So although they had sort of strange ideas of doing designs, they made their pottery very uniform, quite well made.
That's great. And Stuart and John are thanking you for the great talk. They really enjoyed the talk. And Lynn also wrote, I definitely learned some stuff. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, great. This, by the way, this is my book plate design, and I'm interpreting this. Okay, I'm going to stick my head out. This is a Prescott culture pizza, and a little tiny slice has been taken out, and they're thinking about maybe taking this slice out. But it's unusual.
Creative, maybe.
All of their designs are pretty creative, and you could say that the same thing about stuff coming out of the Kant area or the Little Colorado. It's creative, but it's more formal. Or you could say more uptight.
Precise. Okay, well, it looks like that's all of, oh, Cynthia wrote, looks like play. Like playing, or like you were mentioning, probably a child playing fingerprint.
Okay, playfulness is something that we don't talk about too often in designs. But if you really talk to artists, a lot of playfulness is what they're doing. It may not look like it but it really is a form of play in many cases.
Yes, she wrote playing by design, or playing with design.
And doing a design, I should have said a few things about this design. This is a really complex design. This is really hard to do on the interior of a surface. But then you have a sort of little interesting, it's quite symmetrical in terms of a rotation symmetry, but then you've got some little odd things hanging around. So they're fun. They're fun to look at.
Yes. It's great. And it looks like we're done with our chat comments, and there are no questions or other comments in the other Q&A box. So I just want to again thank everyone. Thank you, Andy, for joining us. Thank you, Al, for your awesome technical directorship. And we also want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. Please consider making a donation to help pay for Old Pueblo's Zoom subscription, program expenses, and to support Old Pueblo's education programs like this one tonight. Thank you all and have a great night. And please think about joining us again for the next Food for Thought program.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks,
Thanks,
you,
everybody.
Andy. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.